wanted to give you all a heads up that we, in addition to the wonderful faces in the room, we have lots of people joining us via Hangout, via live stream rather. So we'll be having questions from outside of the room too. Delighted to welcome my colleague Mark Masterson for our third in the series of our Google Tools Entrepreneurs Edition. So without further ado, CTO in a box, over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for coming out this afternoon. There's a lot to go through in this talk, so I'm going to try to move as quickly as I can through the slides. We'll try to do questions at the end, so that's what I'm, in part, trying to move as quickly through them as possible for, so that we can do the questions at the end, if that's okay. So who am I? Why am I standing up here? If you haven't seen one of these talks before, you haven't watched one of them on YouTube and you don't know, my job at Google is I head up the part of developer relations, and I'll explain what that is in a second, within Google that deals with all the startup-facing stuff in Europe. And developer relations is a team within Google, the purpose of which is to engage and empower developers. It's a bit vague, like do no evil. Basically means that what we want is for developers to be able to use Google's platforms and technologies to go off and succeed. So whether that's Android or Google Cloud or whatever, then my team is there ostensibly to help you. And within that team, there is a group that is specifically functioned on the kind of developer that works at a startup. I do a series of talks here at campus where I build on kind of foundational concepts, starting with very specific stuff about how to make an app succeed on the Play Store, an Android app, and then moving on to how to kind of implement one of the 3 startup engines of growth from the Lean Startup book by Eric Ries, and ending with this talk where we talk about what it's like to be a CTO. This is always the most popular one. Not sure why that is. We suspect it's because the title is the coolest, not really sure. My background is a bit checkered, so I'm not necessarily pure enough to be a startup CTO in some people's minds, because I did spend a large part of my career working for really boring companies like banks and insurance companies. And so, you know, when I'm doing that kind of Silicon Drink About thing, or I'm with the 3 Beards guys, I tend not to say that because it's kind of embarrassing. And I would build systems there like policy administration systems for insurance companies. Really dull stuff, but really big stuff too. And at the end of my career, kind of that part of my career, I found myself at an IT services company. I won't say which one it is, but it's the one that's most famous for being the company that runs the outsourced bit of the IT that Edward Snowden hacked at the NSA. They don't really talk about that, surprisingly enough, when you go to their website, that's who they are. But that is who they are. And I had a role there as the head of innovation for the financial services vertical within that company, which I thought was going to be a really cool job. It was going to enable me to go into big companies, banks, and insurance companies, the places I knew best, and talk to them about what LinkedIn, Facebook, Google, Netflix, Amazon, and the other companies like that of the world were doing that was so different from what the enterprise does, bringing in cool and everything. It didn't work. Spent a couple years beating my head on that brick wall that represents the inertia inside big enterprises, and finally got offered an opportunity to escape, so I did. And I went and I joined a startup as the CTO. And this startup was building a streaming media platform for music concerts. Just saying that alone was sometimes enough for an investor to look at his watch, get up, and leave the room. And the platform had some really cool stuff in it, like 360-degree video, and we were going to put you in the concert. And our first piece of content, our launch partner, was Jon Bon Jovi. We filmed a concert of his in Australia. And this picture is from a soft launch party that we did one summer in the Hamptons. Brilliant idea from our then CEO to draw in a bunch of A-list investors to close out our seed round. They'd all come in, have a party, see Bon Jovi, shake his hand, and give us a lot of money. Look at a demo of the product and so forth. Went off like a charm. The party worked without a hitch. My product in particular, I was the CTO, so that was the bit I was worried about. Got a lot of kudos. Everybody loved it. This is a tweet from a woman named Fern Wallace, who, if you don't know, is one of the co-founders of the New York Fashion Week, of my CEO, with Jon Bon Jovi at that party. This party cost us somewhere between, the numbers are still in debate 2 years later, somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000. We got less than 10 back in investment. This is what accountants refer to as a negative ROI. My CEO then declared victory, however, by moving the goalposts, redefining the definitions of what victory were, and saying, well, but we got 500,000-ish tweets from retweets from Mollis's picture of me with Jon Bon Jovi. Victory! Social media PR win. 3 months later, we were out of cash, no payroll, company folded. Those tweets didn't do us any good. In Eric Ries's book, The Lean Startup, which we'll talk about a bit today, he refers to those as vanity metrics. And this is my vanity metrics story. So what will we cover today? We're going to cover tools about ways to think. We're going to cover patterns and ways to recognize patterns and ways to exploit what you recognize in patterns. What I'm not going to do is give you any fish, right? I'm going to instead ruin a very potentially lucrative business opportunity here and attempt to teach you how to catch some yourself, right? So in specific terms, for any of you who might be the kind of person who would be interested in this, we aren't going to do any of this today. No code, no code. Just those terribly boring things called concepts. So what does this mean, think like a CTO? Well, primarily what it means, in my view, is recognizing the deep patterns that drive the why question around us at all time. In a conversation I just had at Level 39, an accelerator down the road in Canary Wharf, one of the questions I got was, what's the difference really between a CTO and like a VP of engineering? And the first thing you say, of course, is if you're a startup and you're trying to have a CTO and a VP of engineering, you're probably doing something wrong. My startup did. But the second part of the answer to the question is, classically, if you can afford that sort of division of labor and those sorts of division of roles, then ideally, the division should be this. The CTO role is the guy who's focused on the why. Why is this happening? Why isn't that happening? Why should we do this? Why shouldn't we do that? And your next level down, your VP of engineering, your lead developer, whatever, he takes that why and he figures out the how. So to think like a CTO is to be relentlessly, obsessively focused on the why. And the why is what happens when you can see the matrix, right? Neo can suddenly dodge bullets and reach into the matrix and do really powerful things because he understands why the things around him are happening. This is power. Power to succeed and make money and become a unicorn and all the things that you're really trying to do. Sometimes, when you're trying to learn a new thing, a really powerful technique to get started with that is to focus on what you're doing wrong and unlearn it. That opens your brain up and makes you more receptive for the new thing that you're trying to pour in there. And more than likely, if you're a tech person with more than like 3 years of experience, you're doing something really wrong. So how many people would say they roughly fit that description? You're a tech person with more than 3 years of experience. Okay, so about half the room, and perhaps maybe about half of the online audience. Let's take a guess, I don't know. This concept is a quote from a piece of work by a Polish philosopher named Alfred Korzybski. I'm going to mispronounce his name, I always do, from the 30s. And it's about this concept that maps are not the thing that they map. This is a blindingly obvious concept when you look at it from a certain perspective. Everybody knows that this is not London, right? And you know it in these very deep, visceral ways. So if you know, for example, that this is not London, then you may also know that there are certain places on this map where it takes 5 minutes to walk it and 20 minutes to take the tube. Because this is not London. And yet it's still an extraordinarily powerful and useful tool that you probably use every day. The distinction, however, remains clear to you. When you start to build software, probably not so much. Why? Because in software, which is inherently extraordinarily complex, software is not made of physical things like this. It's made of what I sometimes in my slightly more poetic moments refer to as thought stuff. And in that sense, it's more like art. It's a purely creative thing. And it's very hard to structure. So we intuitively seek structure for it, and we draw pictures. And the problem is, we very quickly lose sight of the fact that that's not the thing. This is just a picture of it, a map. Why is that bad? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but one of them, and the one I'm going to pick out for today, is because we think that because this map is tidy, that's a good thing. That the tidiness of it, in and of itself, is a good thing. We think that this picture over here is inherently superior to this picture here. And in fact, as engineers, we're explicitly trained that the concept, you'll hear it referred to in the vernacular as a hairball, is a bad thing, it's a negative thing. When you encounter a hairball in architecture, you want to clean it up, you want to refactor it, you want to rationalize, you want to make it better. You want to make it more like the tidy picture. Anybody know what this is a picture of? This hairball that I picked out? The brain, that's a good guess because it looks very organic. Somebody else said to me, looks like a snowflake. That's also kind of a good guess because it's clearly fractal in structure, and I don't think that's a coincidence. I think anytime you see this kind of complex adaptive structure, you're likely to see fractal patterns, but no, it's not a snowflake either.
Internet.
It is. It's a picture of the World Wide Web. Why is that interesting? Well, quite frankly, objectively, the World Wide Web is the single most successful systems integration project that the human species has ever achieved. Looking at it in this way is a bit like being on the space station and looking down at the Great Wall of freaking China. This thing is amazing. And it doesn't look anything like one of those neat and tidy boxes with pictures of wires and things on. It looks like a giant hairball. As does, of course, the thing we carry around with us up here. It doesn't look like one of those pictures either. And this is a deep pattern. And when you see it, right, what I'm trying to do today, if I can, is impart this itch in you, where when you see a thing like this, it starts to itch. You think, I think that's all right. I think that's really good, but man, there's a lot of good stuff over there that looks like this. Something's wrong. Itch. Because that's the black cat in the matrix, that itch. That's the black cat walking by. And if you can see it, then you can seize it. And that's how you become a unicorn. That's how you become the guy standing on the curb thinking, why the hell is it so hard to get a cab? And he thinks, Uber! And the shine of light comes down on him, and the angels sing, and the choirs of heaven rejoice. If you want to be that person, you have to learn to spot the black cat. And it's there where these things are out of sync. Why are they so often out of sync? I have a friend. He does a lot of things, and he was here at Campus London a couple of weeks ago doing a talk on his recent work, which I'll talk about in a sec. One of his current roles is he's working with Andreessen Horowitz, and his really cool job title there is Philosopher in Residence. And his name is Venkatesh Rao, and he's done a thing called Breaking Smart for Andreessen Horowitz. If you haven't heard of that, haven't read it, write it down, go Google the words Breaking Smart. Brilliant series of, it's a book basically, but he published it on the web about some of the things that I'm talking about today. And he refers to the problem that we're talking about here, this problem that we seek simplicity where it's inappropriate, as the taxonomic urge. I thought that was brilliant. And to his point, it's part of the biological hardware in our heads because, you know, when we're out there on the savannah in the Paleolithic age, the ability to simplify and make sense of what's around us was essential to survival. But like many of those Paleolithic things, in the 21st century, sometimes they're more of a handicap than they're more of a bug than a feature. And they limit us. And the whole body of kind of Western thought, starting with Plato and his Platonic forms, is part of the problem. It too is a bug, not a feature. We'll talk about another one like that later on. So when you see this, and you realize something's wrong, a really key thing to understand here is that most other people probably haven't. Even though their arm is off and it's lying on the ground bleeding, they deny it. They say, no, it's not. Getting a cab is fine. I don't know what you're complaining about. I can't imagine anything other than my arm is off lying on the ground. Why would it be better? If you can see that your arm is off, or his arm is off, or her arm is off, then you have the power. And spotting those things is what we're going to talk about today. So let's talk about some tools that can help you do that. This is going to look really boring. I'm going to try to make it less boring, I promise. This is a thing called the risk exposure formula. Have you ever heard of it before? One hand. Wow, 2 hands. 3 hands. Wow, that's 3 more than usual. So the risk exposure formula gets used in a lot of different places. It's taught in MBA courses in many universities. It's used in nuclear power plants to do audits of their security systems. It's used in IT security, which is where I first encountered it. Basically, the notion here is very simple. If you look at a given risk, whatever it is, and you evaluate how likely it is to happen, the bad thing, and what it will cost in some abstract sense if the bad thing will happen. The product of those two things is your total risk exposure. So let's break that down and analyze why that's so powerful. The left-hand side of the equation is basically about fault prevention. The likelihood side is about trying to prevent the bad thing from happening. You want to drive the likelihood down to 0% if you can. Most of the things you do every day are on the left-hand side of the equation. Anytime you do an estimate, take a guess at how much something's going to cost, how long it will take, how many resources you're going to need, those are likelihood of failure things. Those are all activities, the purpose of which is to control and ideally drive down the likelihood of failure. This is an extremely powerful tool. And in fact, since the 60s, almost all of our IT systems have been focused on it. This is all SAP does, frankly, is that likelihood of failure side of the equation. But it has a little catch. If the likelihood of failure is non-zero, and it always is, then the failure will happen sooner or later. That very simple sentence is at the heart of that famous book, The Black Swan, by Nassim Taleb, who we'll talk about also a little later in another context. It will always happen. So if it will, you need to know what your cost of failure is on the other side, because if it's cataclysmic, bad equation, right? No one believed that blimps would crash. But when one did, the cost was so high that it stopped an entire industry, as with the crash of the Hindenburg here in New Jersey, not far from where I was born. The right-hand side of the equation is about fault tolerance. It's about if the bad thing happens, it's not so bad. If you drive the cost of failure down far enough, then it doesn't really matter if your arm's chopped off. If you can grow a new one, chop it off, baby, go on. Who cares? How can you grow a new arm? That is what your brain needs to be doing as a CTO in the 21st century. Not trying to figure out, how can I avoid that bad guy cutting my arm off? That's 20th century. Think about, how can I grow a new arm? In old school technology, we've always known this. Redundant arrays of independent disks, RAID, is a concept that was invented almost 50 years ago, and it's about driving down the cost of failure, not the likelihood. This thing, RAID, which is a word you might not have never heard before if you're not a geek, destroyed the mainframe industry. That's how powerful this tiny thing was. It took it a while, but it did, and ultimately enabled the internet. Wouldn't you like to invent something like that? And it's thinking about the right-hand side of the equation where you get that kind of payoff. In terms of organizational design, things on the right-hand side of the equation are things like short feedback loops, smaller batches, agile, lean. Anywhere you see these words, you are seeing a thing that is a manifestation of something happening on the right-hand side of the equation about cost of failure. In engineering terms, the left-hand side of the equation is about mean time to failure, like building a refrigerator that lasts 50 years. That's about likelihood of failure. The right-hand side of the equation is about mean time to recovery, like building a refrigerator that when it fails, it spawns a new one, and you just get a new refrigerator, so you can throw the old one away. That's mean time to recovery. How can I do that? Things are happening all around you. Signs and signals are everywhere that something really important is being driven by this formula. This is about the cost of failure. How many people have heard this buzzword before? DevOps. Right, so it takes a minute, you're all shy, but then almost every hand in the room goes up because it's everywhere at the moment. You can't get on an airplane without seeing it on some magazine. That's how ridiculously ubiquitous it's become. And it's about the collapse between development and operations, the guys who used to run the machines and the guys who program the stuff for the machines, the people that do that, they used to be very separate. And that was because the cost of failure, if these guys did something wrong over here, was very high and I couldn't control for it. So I built these slow, long, careful feedback loops where I checked and double checked and triple and quadruple and quintuple checked everything along the way to make sure to drive the likelihood down. But somewhere along the way, 10 years ago, things started to happen underneath that foundation that eroded the value proposition of that approach.
things started to get so cheap that people who just skipped that step were suddenly getting competitive advantage because the overhead of going that slow was suddenly a bug, not a feature. And this is what's driving DevOps. The cost of failure of other things has dropped, so now I can begin to change organizationally and exploit cost of failure drops as well. Cascading effects. In biology, this is really very clear and simple to understand. An organization on this side of the equation is one that biologists refer to as robust. It's optimally evolved for its niche. Everything about it, it's an alpha predator, for example, and everyone quakes in fear of it in the niche that it lives in. But if something happens in that context in which it's optimal for, that it isn't prepared for, if the ice starts to melt, it turns out that these robust organisms are also very fragile. And as soon as the context changes, they break. Things that are optimized for the other side of the equation, like, say, the Ebola virus, are very adaptable. And if you sense that I'm making an argument here today that one side of this equation is more important than the other, you're right. I think the right-hand side of the equation is more important. And it turns out I'm not alone. Charles agrees that adaptability is vastly more significant to the success of a species than robustness. You focus on robustness when you can't control your cost of failure. But when you can control your cost of failure, that's where the big payoffs lie. This is the book that Nassim Taleb wrote when he was done explaining to us about the black swan, and this one is all about the cost of failure. So if you think this is interesting and you haven't read it, it's a terrible book, bit of a slog, hard to read, but well worth it. And the can of worms that it opens up is huge, much more than we can cover in just this brief talk. How many people have heard of chaos monkeys? 2, 3, so maybe a third of the room. How many people use Netflix? Or have used Netflix? Don't have to use it all the time. Used it once or more, right? Every hand goes up. Brilliant. How many people know that Netflix has software agents running all the time in production behind the screen as you watch it on your telly, breaking things? Right, those are the same hands that went up that said, I knew what a chaos monkey is, because that's what a chaos monkey is. In production, Netflix has software agents that breaks things. They turn off databases, corrupt network links, shut things down, break things, tear them apart. They attack credit card servers. They do distributed denial of service attacks. They break things. As you're watching Broadchurch or whatever, they're breaking things. This is because their environments are so robust that breaking things has no impact. Their cost of failure is so low that they can break things left and right, and everything just keeps chugging along. You don't even notice. And why are they breaking things? To prove that that's the case, and to continually prove it going forward, and to improve it in feedback loops that are very short and powerful. This is one of the premier examples of how this approach can make you the most powerful company in your industry. All right, let's talk about some other tools. Money. Who knows what these 3 letters mean? Do you know what they mean? Call it out. Net present value. What's it for? Don't explain to me what it is. That'll take too long. Just what's it for?
Assessing projects.
Assessing projects or an investment. You use this tool to assess whether an investment is a good or a bad idea. If the value that you calculate coming out the back of this is greater than 1, probably a good investment. Is 1 or higher, good investment. If it's less than 0, probably a bad idea. You should leave that. Why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because as the CTO, what you need to be able to do is then, as you begin to see patterns, you recognize the black cat, you're starting to get a sense for the whys of things, you're starting to realize, ooh, DevOps, the why of that is cost of failure. Where does that go? You're going to need to make choices about how to spend the money that your company doesn't have very much of. And you need to know how to use the more powerful tools available to you. This particular one has a trap lurking in it that I like to call to people's attention. What happened? What did I just do? Want to see it? I'll do it again. Look. What's going on there? Oh, well, of course, now it's frozen up because I went up and down too many times, so now you can't see anything happening at all. Hang on. Well, Google Sheets wakes up. when in doubt, reboot. Dun, 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 dun. So what's happening now is that my cost of failure is fairly high. And I was hoping that the likelihood of failure was fairly low, see? All right, we'll do it the slow way then. Check it out. You'll be able to see all my ugly slides, but that's all right. So, what's going on? When I do this, what's going on? It's changing. Why is it changing? Any idea?
Are you removing or adding the error?
Not exactly. That's part of what's happening, but here's what's actually happening. There's two different versions of this. One is good for one kind of thing, and one is good for another. Oops. Why is that a big deal? And why is that a big deal for the kinds of tools that we're talking about? How many versions of this are there in Microsoft Excel, for example, or even in Google Sheets? Which one you reckon it is? Which is the dominant, traditional purchased? What are you doing in a 21st century startup? You buying a lot of things? Yeah, you buying a lot of servers? Buying a lot of data centers? Where are you getting them from? Amazon, maybe Google. How are you paying for that? Sorry, what was it? Were you buying it? No. Oh, wait, you're leasing it. So you want to evaluate whether that's a good idea, bad investment, good investment. You want to use NPV, maybe in Excel. Oops, wrong version. This is significant, as it turns out, because getting the right version of the formula can help you work out whether the money that you're spending is actually good money or bad money. You need to be aware of these kinds of things about the tools that you're using. And this is your job as the CTO. Why do I call this particular one out? It's pretty boring, it's dull, it's amusing that there's only one version in Excel or even in Google Sheets, but that's not the why. The why is because I'm trying, again, to rewire your brain a bit. The difference between somebody who's a chief developer, a lead developer, a chief engineer, is that he's not really interested in and paying attention to the money. But the CTO has to be. And once you start to pay attention to the money, then you need to be able to see the black cats there too. The deep patterns that underlie the why of things. Why am I paying for this versus that? Why should I build a hairball or not? What's the difference between these two things? Anybody know? Can you guess? I've actually given you enough information today that you might be able to guess, even if you've never seen the terms before. How many people have heard the term microservices before? It's about a quarter of the room. So microservices, if you don't know, is just this super cool term for modern cloud-native kinds of architectures, a way of building software that's different from the way we used to do it. All of the logos on this slide are about it. And these buzzwords you probably have heard of, or if you haven't, then your CTO really is incompetent, frankly. But why? What's the why? If people are building microservices today, as opposed to big monolithic things yesterday, what's the why? Why are they doing it that way? Adaptability, which is about cost of failure. If one of these things fails, guess what? The Hindenburg. If one of these things fails, guess what? Well, one of those things failed. Everything else chugs along. It's about cost of failure. It's the why. Your developers will be clamoring around you going, man, I want to use Docker. I want to use Kubernetes. You need to know why. But much more important, not just why they're doing that, because the why of their doing that might be no more interesting than they saw it on Stack Overflow or they read some blog and they think it's really cool. Their why might not be very important, but your why, the why that you're seeking is, why might that be better than? Why might my company be able to extract some competitive advantage from doing this versus that? That why, that's the why that a CTO must seek relentlessly. Who's heard of these two horrible terms? Ooh, that's a good turnout. That's almost half the room. Who can tell me what they mean? Go on then.
Representational state transfer.
Excellent. And the other one, that's even harder.
Hypertext as the engine of application state.
Oh, brilliant. Oh, brilliant. Did you get one of those cardboard folding things?
I did.
Excellent. I don't have anything else to give you. Well, you can have these playbooks. They're actually free and anybody can have one anyway. But just, for the token, that's brilliant. That's the first time anybody's been able to decode this one, which is really hard. But it's actually the important one. So what is this stuff? So this attractive gentleman right here, his name is Roy Fielding. And he invented HTTP. Trivial thing. And after he did that, a couple years later, he sat down and he thought, what's going on, right? And he said, I want to understand the architecture of this. And so he wrote a dissertation on it, which is now one of the landmark papers in computer science. And the thing that he called the architecture of the web is representational state transfer, abbreviated REST. It's the architecture of the hairball. And it is, at the moment, in the 21st century, in my opinion, the fundamental black cat moment, technologically speaking. It is the matrix itself. It allows you to see why the web's architecture works the way it does. And if you can understand that, then you can exploit it. Hypertext as the engine of application state is actually the important bit inside the dissertation that explains to you what you should then go do on top of the architecture of the web. And it's so horrible that many people have tried to come up with other acronyms to describe the same thing. This is my favorite. Hydra. Hypermedia-driven architectures. I think that's much sexier. But actually, all three-letter acronyms are horrible, so never mind. Once you begin down this path as the CTO, there is no going back. You begin to learn and unlearn things that change your view of everything around you. For example, I said that we'd get back to something a bit like Platonic forms. It turns out that Newtonian time is a bug, not a feature. We've actually known that for, like almost a century, since Einstein and quantum physics and all that stuff. Relativity is called relativity for a reason, right? But in computer science, throughout that entire period, we have continued to treat Newtonian time as a feature, not a bug, up until fairly recently. Who's heard the words eventual consistency before? Right. Again, not too many hands. That's not a good sign. So eventual consistency is a high-level buzzword that's actually about this, that Newtonian time is a bug, not a feature. And it drives every modern database in the world. Who's heard, let's go a little higher up in the stack, who's heard the term NoSQL? Guess what? That's about Newtonian time being a bug, not a feature. It's the why. Why is Cassandra more interesting than Oracle? Why? Not because it's sexy, not because the cool kids use it, not because it'll make your shoes look better. It's because Newtonian time is a bug, not a feature. And if you understand that, you can exploit it. Eventual consistency is this underlying concept. Google built a world-spanning database called Spanner, and the only reason we were able to build it is because we understand this. That horrible blue face thing that people use every day all over the world in billions and billions and billions and billions sustains that load of billions and billions and billions and billions because they understood this. Those 4T guys who sold WhatsApp to that horrible blue face thing for 40 billion built a thing that exploited the understanding that Newtonian time is a bug, not a feature. It's not a trivial thing. If you're not the CTO, this isn't your job necessarily to understand. But a secondary subsidiary goal of today's talk is to inoculate you with enough of these concepts that you'll understand who to talk to in an interview, how to recognize the CTO that you do want. And if he doesn't understand that time is a bug, not a feature, Newtonian, then you want to get rid of him. I tried to cook this stuff down for you to make it a bit more digestible because it's a bit all over the place, and I get that. I couldn't do it. And I tried to, make it kind of go with the hairball thing. I couldn't do that either. So this was the best I could do. The hirsute pattern. And RSE are the key letters in here. And what I'm trying to do, and it's actually the wrong way around, Since I have all the interesting stuff on the right-hand side of the formula and all the boring stuff on the left hand, I should have done it that way, but of course, I'm a Yank, so I was trained to read left to right, and so I just did it this way without thinking about it, because that's how brains work. And I didn't notice the black cat. So I fell for old, ingrained patterns of thinking. But in this model, everything on the left is the cool stuff now, and everything on the right is the old stuff. So anytime you hear somebody talking about one of these things, disaster recovery, business continuity, yada, 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 they're talking about, by and large, likelihood of failure stuff. And you should be thinking, dude, you're just trying to figure out how to not get your arm chopped off. How can I think of a way to grow a new arm? As you begin to process in these models, what I'm hoping you'll begin to see is that these are where, in the cracks between these things, the opportunities lie that you can exploit. If you are, for example, in a startup that's entering a market that's crowded, it's got a lot of competitors. Look at what your competitors are doing and try to figure out, what are they doing that's got a fairly high cost of failure? Because if you can figure that out, and then you can figure out how to do the same thing, but with a low cost of failure, ka-ching! So all of these things, as we go through them, map to some new thing that does a cost of failure version of it. Finally, I'm going to give you two more things, and then we're done, and I'll stop yapping at you. Stigmergy. Who's heard that term before? It's a biological term. Yeah, I'm always surprised at how few hands go up on this one. This is about the way that organisms leave signals for other organisms, and that allows what I like to refer to as emergent collaboration to happen. The classic example of this is ant trails, which is why that's the picture there. You know, ants leave these pheromones behind, and other ants can sense them, and that's how they know where to go to get the food. The ants don't talk to each other. As a CTO, you have an additional role, and that role, particularly in the kinds of companies that I've been talking about today, is to leave signals behind. Again, organizational changes that are driven by things like cost of failure. Old models like GE and GM that were very top-down and very hierarchical are about controlling for the likelihood of failure, and those models require broadcasts where this guy up top tells this guy and this guy and this guy, and they amplify down. The low cost of failure version of that model has people moving in space, leaving signals behind, and as other people come along behind them, they pick up the signals and just know what to do. As you begin to spot black cats, you need to figure out ways to drop a signal. Don't try to figure out a way to turn around and tell the guy behind you, oh, I saw a black cat. Don't do that. Figure out a way to drop a signal. Again, I'm not going to give you any fish. I'm not going to tell you how to do that. I'm just trying to give you an idea of how to go find some yourself. And finally, when you've unlearned a bad pattern, it's often a good thing then to work out, well, what's the better version of that, right? So there's a version of maps called Wardley Maps by a friend of mine named Simon Wardley, which if you've never heard of them before, and hands up if you've heard of these, Wardley Maps? Yeah, okay. This is a rather obscure thing, extremely powerful. What maps are actually good for, they're a specific category of model, of abstract model. What they're really good for is two things. Situational awareness, where am I? In relation to, where am I? Where's Old Street? Right. Situational awareness and motion. How do I get from where I am to there? That's the kind of map that you want. A map that shows you, my business is here, TransferWise is there, Barclays is over there, and I want to be there. Wardley Maps are a way to draw that kind of a picture about your business, and I cannot recommend them highly enough. Having talked badly about maps at the beginning, I'd like to conclude on a positive note about maps with this particular example, and cannot encourage you highly enough to go check it out. Very, very powerful tool, particularly for a startup. Finally, a plug. In Europe, I run a program for Google called Launchpad, which is free. You sign up for it online, and you get free stuff. Cost of failure, pretty low. Likelihood of failure, also pretty low. Kind of a no-brainer. You go to the URL here, and you apply. There's an application form you have to pitch. You have to explain to me what you're doing. And then we'll take you. We take everybody, frankly. We'll take everybody. We want, you know, like take porn and payday loans and gambling and those, but everybody else, come on in. We'll take you. The only kind of caveat is you have to have a product. So you have to have something already. So too early stage, we'll say, nope, thanks, come back in, you know, 6 months or whatever. And if you're an agency developing products for somebody else, there's a different program for you. So it has to be your product, your thing. But if you fit that very broad category, jump right in, join the program, it's free. What do you get? Well, you get some stuff like, you know, AdWords, credits, and boring crap like that, which most people think is the best part. I don't. I think the soft benefits are much more important, because what you get as being in the program is you get me looking after you, frankly. And that can be useless or extremely powerful, depending, right? So on the one end, there's some free stuff that you can just invoke, like you can get a UX review, an architecture review, and I can help you navigate the waters of Google to find the right person to talk to. At the opposite end of the spectrum, I once found a startup at an accelerator not far from here that was doing something really cool with parking data, took them in to meet the Maps for Work team, they signed an NDA, they now do joint go-to-market things. We sell their stuff along with ours. That's not going to happen to you, quite frankly. A bit like winning the lottery. But it can happen only if you're in the program. So sign up, please. And that's all I've got for you. Any questions? Come on. The first person always has to ask, and then the room just goes, oh, yeah, what about this? Inch your hand. Yeah, go on.
How would you think it would be until we have, rather than, sort of, I guess, cloud infrastructure as a service, actually having functions as a service? So, you know, the web becomes like marketplace, actual kind of A2B kind of computation.
So your question, I'll play it back for you because I'm not sure even I heard it enough and probably everybody else did. Your question is, how do we go from having applications as a service to actual functions as a service, where individual, really fine-grained functions?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's already happening, frankly. And I think that one of the key things about going and digging into stuff that looks ostensibly boring, like the REST dissertation by Fielding, is understanding how to make that happen, right? So once at an insurance company, I worked out how we could do an insurance claim, right? So your car's been hit, you need to make a claim, entirely using HTTP. There were no back-end servers at all. Just HTTP, a state machine modeled entirely in HTTP. So you didn't need a back-end. That was so radical that the insurance company said, I don't want that. What would my entire IT department do? There'd be nothing left to build. Yeah, well, exactly. So yes, very fine-grained functions, I think, are the obvious evolutionary path that we're on. But I think that's already happening. And I think you see that already in the microservices concept, which is one small thing, do it really well, do nothing else, inside the microservice. I think that's already part of what's going on.
This is more something specific to Launchpad. So I work as a change management person, manager. But I've got 2 startups going. But we're just in the stage of developing our first version. So I guess once we've developed that first version, we could apply for
So the question is, I've got a startup, I've got 2 in this case. We're just kind of in that conceptual stage. We don't yet have the product. Do we have to wait till we have the product to apply? No. If you can convincingly, in your pitch, argue to me that you're on a trajectory where you're going to develop that product, and it doesn't have to be a Google product. It can be an iOS-only app, for example. We'll take that too. But you have to be able to explain to me, here's where we are, and here's where we're going. And if that pitch is convincing enough, we'll let you in. Okay, back there again. Louder this time, please.
How can you find the cheap kind of legal advice, setting up business contacts and stuff?
Cheap legal advice. Yeah, sorry, that's not really a strength of the Launchpad program or Google, so I'm not sure I can handle that. But here on campus, and I'm not sure if Fran is still in the room, they often do offer those kinds of mentoring sessions here as part of the overall program at campus. So if you're not a member at campus already, then I would encourage you to sign up for that, because that is the kind of thing that's often available here.
Every Friday, different topic each week. Sign up on the website. We bring different teams over from Google for analytics, AdWords, multiple topics.
So I saw a hand here, and then yours over there. Go on.
So this is really interesting in terms of concepts to think about as a CTO, and you specifically said you're not going to do any work in code.
I did, didn't I? Thank you.
How important is it for the CTO to understand code?
Yeah, great question. Great question. Great question. Okay, so
The question was, I explicitly said I'm not going to do any working code, how important it is for the CTO to understand code. I think it's essential. I think it's absolutely critical. I think typically in a resource-constrained startup, you often can't afford not to have a developer as your CTO. And in fact, having that can be an anti-pattern, right? So if you have the kind of CTO who's too conceptual, too abstract, and doesn't do enough of the coding, that can be an anti-pattern in itself. My startup suffered from that. I was guilty of that myself. I did too much PowerPoint and too little coding, and that was part of the reason why the startup struggled, I think, as badly as it did. So that was a learning for me. It's a luxury that you can really only afford in terms of division of labor when you get to a specific size. I saw Reid Hoffman, that's the co-founder of LinkedIn, right? I saw him do a talk at London Tech Week a couple of months ago, when London Tech Week was, whenever that was. And he said something that really made a penny drop for me, that I had, articulate this idea that just, it's blindingly obvious in retrospect, but that articulation is sometimes the genius of a thing. He said, when a company goes from 1 to 10, 10 to 100, 100 to 1,000, whatever, at each of those milestones, what happens is the old company gets thrown away and a new one gets created. And that's absolutely right. And if that doesn't happen, and you kind of muddle along with the old company still trying to function as it used to before you hit that milestone, that's why things fail. And it's at those thresholds where you can begin to get the kind of division of labor where you have a CTO who focuses only on this and not on that. But only after you've hit one of those scaling thresholds is that really the kind of thing you can afford, literally, to do.
So just as a follow-up, in finding a CTO, you want to find someone who understands code back to front
Yes.
and is able to think.
Yes, and of course that's impossible. So the question was, so what you're saying is you need to find somebody who can do both these things. So what I suggest, and this is just my personal advice, you got to take it with a massive grain of salt, of course. What you're looking for is somebody who demonstrates that they can think like this. You're not necessarily looking for somebody with a massive amount of experience doing this. You're looking for somebody who thinks this way. There are developers who will come to you and say, dude, I've totally figured out what you want to do, and we just need to do this and put this on GitHub, and we'll do this over here, and we'll get some Docker, and it'll be fine. Whereas if you're talking to somebody and he's going, you know what, I think TransferWise is probably doing this wrong. And I think if we did this instead, bingo, ka-ching. It's the way they think. That's what you're looking for, rather than a specific bag of tricks that they know how to do, good or bad, right? One of the things that I look for is people who come to me and say in an interview, I hate it when people say, have you got 5 years experience in MongoDB? Because those people are already bumping up against that problem. Those are the kinds of people who think, and they're already bumping up against the people around them who don't. That's why they say that. The other people who say that are people who are just, posers and idiots and just can't stand that when people ask them for real qualifications, but they're usually really easy to flush out. And say, oh, no, all right, you brush them away. But the guy who seems to know what he's talking about and still complains about the 5 years of MongoDB, go look harder at that girl or man, because those are the people who think. Best I can do.
Can you talk to me about the personality of a good CTO?
The personality of a good CTO? Well, not like mine. No, not really. I think that's as diverse as the wonderful rainbow of diversity of humanity that surrounds us. I don't think there's a personality type that's specifically correlated with being a good CTO. The only kind of personality trait that maybe is common to that wonderful rainbow is a bit of obsessiveness, a bit of, I just saw the black cat, where did it go? That sort of, curiosity. But apart from that, no, I don't think that, no. I don't know.
When hiring a CTO, of course you need to tell this person your idea. What if this person doesn't get it? How do you solve that very abstract idea?
Okay.
A technical person.
Okay, so the question is, how do you, if the CTO that you're interviewing, you're seeking to hire, doesn't get it, how do you get that across? Well, in general, so this is a hard thing to answer and out of context and blah, 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 but in general, I would suggest that if the person doesn't get it, no matter how hard you try, and you need to try maybe 2 or 3 times, they're not the right person. It's really that simple, because that person we were just talking about over there, she thinks
And so even if she doesn't get it, she's going to go, oh, wait, but hang on. Did you think about this? And that may take you in a whole new direction, but they're thinking, right? Those people will get it. So if you bump into somebody who just resolutely doesn't, then it's probably the wrong person. It's probably not a problem with your idea. That's not always true, but as kind of a rule of thumb, that's what I would say.
So you think that if an idea is great, if the idea is great, the good CTO will likely join, even anything else you cannot overcome.
I think that if your idea is great, somebody who could be a great CTO will see that and get excited about it too. And if your idea is crap, somebody who might be a good CTO would see that too and say, actually, I don't think that idea is crap, and would tell you that in an interview. And that is kind of the signal spectrum that I would be looking for. So that hand out, then this hand, then that hand, and then that hand, in that sequence. So go on.
Okay, so you talked a lot about the why.
Yeah.
In today's world, I'm reading a lot about this whole thing of data-driven decisions.
Data-driven decisions, yep. Google, data-driven company.
Yeah. So how would you say in terms of the CTO, we're talking about the
Yeah,
why?
yeah.
How does that relate to the
Okay. So there's a really famous saying, I forget who said it, data without context is meaningless, right? So there's this whole body of academic work called information theory, which is about this notion that data in context becomes this incredibly valuable thing called information. And that's the answer to your question, I think. Data-driven is actually a very bad thing, and I wish Google wouldn't use it. I wish Google would say we're an information-driven company, because that would be a thing that would recognize and communicate stigmergy. Hey, we get that. We know what, yeah? So data-driven, wrong approach. The data alone is a means to an end, and the end is information that shows you where the black cat is.
Where would you advise to go in your search for a CTO?
So if you're watching out there, and it seems like all these questions are about, I don't have a CTO, where do I find one? That is actually a very particular characteristic of the London and the UK startup scene. That tech people are very rare and very much in demand, and it's really hard to find one, particularly a good one who will work at the rates that you can afford to pay. I think that the way to answer that question is to seek out places where the kind of animal that you're hunting is likely to congregate, right? So you want to find the water hole and this is one of them, absolutely. This is one of them. This place, this building, this community that Fran curates together with Sarah Drinkwater is one of those places. Go there. The bulletin board downstairs is a feverish hub of people looking for those sorts of people for precisely that sort of reason. But every other place like this, other co-working spaces, meetups, things like that. And what you need to start to suss out is what are the meetups that seem to be focused on the kinds of questions that we were talking about here? Because those are the places that those why people are going to be drawn to. Less, kind of the dry, how do I program this in that language sort of a thing, but more the microservices. Why is that? Is that total bullshit? I think that might be bullshit. Let's go find out. That's where you're going to find your CTO. I can't do much better than that, I'm sorry. It's a hard problem. So I think back there, and then you were the next hands. Go on.
Yeah, hi. I was going to ask you, what are from your own opinion, what are like the main 3 questions you should ask the CTO when interviewing them?
Okay, so the question is, what are the 3 questions I should ask a CTO in an interview? Wow. I'll have to think about that and come up with a separate talk, because that's a hard question. It's so context dependent. I don't think that any kind of context-free answer would be very useful to you, because the 3 questions that you need to ask are the 3 questions that flush out, is this person the right person for me and what I'm trying to do? So I'm going to have to take a pass and do the kind of slippery consultancy thing and say it depends. And I just don't think 3 abstract, out-of-the-blue kinds of answers to that question would be very useful. They're too context-dependent. However, I will say, join the Launchpad program, get yourself into the program, get access to some mentoring and some help, because in a one-on-one mentoring session, that's precisely the kind of thing we might be able to work out. You can tell me what you're working on, I can understand the context, and then I can say, go look for somebody like this.
You said CTOs will have a time. Do you have any idea why this is particularly the case in the UK? Because I know we push startups and business stuff quite hard on the computer science courses at university.
There are a lot of theories. The one that I find the most plausible is simply the tremendous power of the financial services industry in London. They pay really well, and they've priced the market essentially at a place where it's really hard to find people of that caliber at the price that you're able to pay, right? Just is the way it is.
You're going on the record saying that the financial services industry is harming the startup?
I didn't say that, and some of them are actively trying to support it. No, I'm just saying that an unintended consequence of the financial ecosystem that has been created here is that it's hard to find those sorts of people for startups, yes. In the back.
So you were talking earlier about leasing rather than buying and playing on that contracting and freelancers, getting them involved with your startup. If they're working remotely, can you see it successfully working without having a collaborative space where everyone meets up?
So let me play that back because I'm not sure I heard all of it. So your question is, can it work when part of your team is remote to the other part of the team and they're not working physically in the same space?
That's right.
Okay, so there's a lot of research that shows that physical co-location is tightly correlated with really high quality software. That's a fact. There's no way to overcome that fact. And if you can figure out a way economically to get your software people all in one room, the likelihood that your software will be of higher quality goes up dramatically. That too is a fact. Having said that, like all of those other facts, it's a fact within the overall matrix in which we live. And if you can figure out a way to sidestep it, then you can gain great power. I do believe that technologies available to us today at very low costs, like Google Hangouts, for example, make it possible to go a long way towards recovering some of that lost value. But you have to be very aggressive about exploiting them. What won't work is where you simply have an outsourced team working in silent isolation and occasionally getting some requirements documentation thrown over the wall and 3 months later sending you something back. That will fail. But if you have a team that's remotely situated from you and you spend every day, all day with a window open on a monitor somewhere in both places with a Hangout going, and you're constantly interacting with each other in this completely serendipitous manner, just using these low-cost technologies that are available to you, that can. You have to learn to exploit what's available to you, to get around some of those constraints. That too is part of the pattern matching stuff that you'll have to do. But I think it's possible, yes.
You talked a little bit about scaling, and of course, startups, you're always scaling, or that's the idea of them. Say you're transitioning from 5 or 10 to say 20 people. That's not an instant transition, yet you've got to change the architecture of how your teams work. And also, you're kind of risking the sort of mythical ManMonth thing of always just talking rather than actually doing. So do you have any advice of how to manage those transitions?
So first off, anybody in the room who has not heard the term Mythical ManMonth before? Hands up if you've never heard it before. If you find yourself interviewing a person who uses those words, hire them right away. Mythical ManMonth, brilliant, famous book from Fred Brooks, one of the chief architects of IBM's operating system, which explains why when you're in a project, throwing more people at the project can actually slow it down and make it worse, not better, because of the overhead of bringing new people up to speed. He demonstrated this, showed it to IBM, and IBM then proceeded for the next, how long, 60 years to completely ignore it, which is brilliant. So your question, if I understand you, is about this scaling transitional problem. How do I get from A to B without, I'm changing the engines mid-flight, basically, and how do I do that without crashing the airplane? Is that the question? Yes. Well, obviously, like, some of the other questions here, hard question. Not intractable, but pretty close to NP complete, right? So not really that easy to do in a context-free sense. I think that the useful things that I can talk about, and again, huge grain of salt in this sort of a context, are the things that I already have, which is be aware of the problems that Reid Hoffman was highlighting, for example, that you're not actually changing the company. You're replacing one with another. Be aware of that is what's happening, and this is what you're actually doing. Because self-awareness is 3/4 of being able to see the matrix and exploit what's happening to you. If you're aware of what's happening, like in one of those cool martial arts movies, then when an unexpected thing happens, you can block it, or you can do something with it. And if you're not, right?
So when you're in that horrible moment where you are trying to do that, the best I can offer to you is be aware that what you're actually doing is replacing the old company with a new one. And then try to work out what the implications of that are. The really hard bit of that is when it means, and the conclusion can be inevitable, and you can still, be the Black Knight denying that your arm's on the ground. It means replacing you, yourself. That's when it really gets hard, but that's a very, very frequent pattern. And you have to be aware of it to be able to integrate it and exploit it usefully. Best I can do, context-free. Any more?
How would you convince your boss that a thinking CTO is important, like the one that didn't like your project about the insurance company?
How do you convince a boss who's not convinced about all this stuff that this is...
The boss thinks that you have to be only technical, can't do any business-related thinking.
This is likely a boss, now this is a joke, likely a boss who's focused on the likelihood of failure. I think the answer to that question is on one level, and so I'm going to seem facetious here, and I'm going to seem like I'm dodging your question, the same as the answer to your question, which is, if that's how your boss is, you need to get a new boss. Get out. Been there, done that myself, and all I can say is, it doesn't work. You can't change those people. I've tried. Sometimes you can. You can do this talk, and you can say, dude, look at this. Go watch this dude on YouTube. He's really kind of strange, but this is interesting. Sometimes that works, but it's the corner case. It's 10% out of 90. It just isn't likely to work. And the way to find a place where you can operate in a manner that you think is better is to find the people who are already naturally inclined to think that way themselves. Sorry. Best I can do.
Hi. If you're at the Stripes and you find your perfect CTO and you are interviewing them and you're discussing price, is equity something that you should be talking about and give them equity in the company?
Oh God, yeah. Oh my word. Yeah, okay, so the question was, sorry, not a stupid question at all, and I didn't mean to imply that. If you're negotiating with a CTO as a startup, do you negotiate just price or equity? You should be negotiating equity over price. Yes. And then the question of how much equity is very tricky and context dependent. We can't really talk about, without talking about what your business is and so forth and so on. But you're a cash-strapped, resource-strapped startup, so in general, you want to be offering equity over salary. One of the challenges in this market in the UK is that you often can't. You have to make some kind of minimum salary available to lure anybody with even remotely the talent and the qualifications that you want into the position. And that's because they've got the equivalent of golden handcuffs at some big blue bank somewhere already, and they can't jump. Again, all I can suggest is go to the watering holes, look for the people who are young and hungry and haven't yet committed to the horrible career in financial services that ruined my life. Because those people are more likely to be useful to you, those people at that stage in their life. Paul Graham at Y Combinator still says that the people that he will fund are the people who are young, single, and hungry, because that's just statistically the most successful model in terms of probabilities. So look for those people first. And only if you're really desperate and you have a lot of investor money can you then go looking for people from the banks to come work for you. In the back. Now he's on his phone. You had a question?
No, I was just asking what's the going rate on the equity part. Like you said, it's variable.
Okay. Were there any online questions, Fran?
Nothing that you haven't answered.
Nothing I haven't. All right, cool. One more in the back, and then over here.
What do you think will win out of JavaScript and Java in the future?
Louder. Louder.
Which language do you think will dominate in the future, JavaScript or Java?
Oh, wow. Dude. So the question was, what do you think is going to be the dominant programming language? So look, and I don't want to pick on you here, right? But that is kind of the opposite question to the remark that this gentleman made about Mythical ManMonth. So if you get somebody in the CTO interview who wants to talk about which is going to be the dominant program language, run away. Find the guy who wants to talk about Mythical ManMonth. Much better choice. Having said that, it is a question that the CTO needs to be aware of and focus on, because the choices that you make in terms of which programming languages, which technologies, which platforms you choose and deploy and whatnot have a significant impact on your business. And all I can say there is that what you're trying to figure out is the why of things, okay? So Java, I think you said Java and JavaScript, were those the two examples you picked out? Java is an example of a language that's geeks refer to as strongly typed. JavaScript is an example of a language that isn't, is what geeks refer to as weakly typed. Over the last 15 years, you will see that there's been a tremendous amount of ferment and activity and things going on in the geek world where the languages that were strongly typed have been under attack and largely supplanted by languages that weren't, that were more weakly typed. I've now told you why that is. Tell me. Why is a language that's weakly typed more interesting to a geek, more powerful, more useful than a language that isn't?
I'm not like a tech person. Let's do the squares and the circles, right?
Yes. And what underlies the squares and the circles?
Easy to adapt.
Easy to. Adaptability, which is about which side of the equation? Cost of failure. Cost of failure. A language that's weakly typed allows you to move very quickly, do a thing, see if it works. If it fails, you do it again. Try it again. Try it again. You iterate in small loops. You get rich feedback. You can move more quickly. A language that's strongly typed forces you to make a guess, estimate, ooh, I'm on the likelihood side, about what's the best solution. Do it, implement it, put it out there, wait, and then see. Longer feedback loop, slower cycle, less information. This is the why. And that's the answer to your question. So it's not necessarily one or the other, but it's the type of language that allows you to move in this manner, to behave in this manner. Those are the languages that are dominant already and will continue to be until somebody comes up with an even better solution to the problem. Any other questions?
One from our online audience, Mark. What should a good CTO do if the CEO is driving a company in a place he doesn't believe in?
Oh, you mean like have a party with Jon Bon Jovi? Well, what he probably shouldn't do is turn up at that party and think, man, do these trousers fit all right? Because that's what I did, and oh, no. I met Jon Bon Jovi, and my wife later said, I think his pecs are implants. I think the answer to that question, unfortunately, is the same as the answer to your question, which is find another CEO, which usually means exit, pull the parachute, get out, and find another startup. In general, getting people to change their mind about things is much harder than finding the people who already agree with you. That's just middle-aged man's wisdom, I'm afraid.
Leaving aside the hungry comment, like that, I think matters more. Like,
sorry, a bit louder, sorry.
Leaving aside the hungry comment.
The hungry comment, yeah.
Like, where do you feel like the young single fits into sort of like finding the right people as well going forward?
So leaving aside the hungry comment, where does it does? Where does young and single fit into the overall? So I think that's a very specific comment to our market, and it's because of the dominance of the financial services industry and all those things. If you're dealing with, and all I'm doing here is parroting Paul Graham, quite frankly. If you're dealing with somebody who is 30-ish, 40-ish, has a house, has a mortgage, has some kids, their cost of failure, their personal cost of failure is necessarily very high already, right? And so they're focused on the likelihood of failure. Whereas somebody who is unencumbered by those things, that may not mean that they're 20, they might be 40 as well, but they might be like Paul Carell and whatever. They're unencumbered and their cost of failure is low. That makes them more willing to take this risk over here because when they do their own version of the formula, the balance out here, the product works, right? So if your cost of failure, personal cost of failure is high, you need to find a way to get your likelihood down very low in order for the RE over here at the product to come out to an acceptable value. That tends to be a paycheck. That's why. And that's the only reason why. People who then have, however, say,
other revenue streams, people who are independently wealthy, people who have inherited money, those people can all have very low cost of failure as well for other reasons. So that's what you're seeking, somebody whose cost of failure is low, frankly, because they're the people who can take the risk. All right, one more question, and then I think we'll wrap it up.
Given that we're enlightened and we can see the matrix, is it, and how frequently should a CTO lie to the rest of the team to keep the company moving in the right direction?
Ooh! Oh! All right, so the question was, I'll repeat it for anybody who couldn't hear. Given that we're all enlightened and we can now see the matrix, how often in a given situation, and again, context-free, so that's my out, how often should a CTO lie to his team in order to keep them moving in the right direction? As often as necessary is the answer to the question. When you are building a team, you're essentially putting together a toolbox with a hammer in and a screwdriver in and a saw in and another kind of hammer in, and often the hammer doesn't need to know anything about the toolbox. It just needs to know, over there's a nail. Go hit it, dude. Go hit it, right? So you've got a guy who's a JavaScript guru, and he can do functions and closures all day long. Go hit the nail. As long as you can guide him in the right direction. The key thing I think there is that what you're seeking, ideally, however, are people that you don't have to lie to. That's your fallback position, right? What you really want is people that you can just drop breadcrumbs for, stick Mergic, and they follow along behind you and do the right thing. You don't even have to tell them to go hit the nail. You just kind of point over there and they go and hit it by themselves. This is the difference between some of the banks and insurance companies that I've worked for and a Google, for example. And the famous Google job interview that you've probably heard so much about is entirely about trying to figure out how you think. What is your thought model? How do you think? How do you solve problems? Not, do you have this particular bag of tricks? Not, do you have this particular set of qualifications? Not, did you go to this school? Some of those things are more or less helpful, but how do you think? Because Google, with its famous rejection rate, is trying to find only the people who can follow along the breadcrumbs without being told what to do. If you can build that company too, then you may also be as successful as Google is, or not. But that's what you're trying to do. Find the people that you don't need to lie to, and only do it if you have to. All right, thank you. This has been a great session, and I'm really glad you came out.